Miracles and Metaphors, Chapter 1, Part 1. Answers to Questions of an Indian Scholar. The first question. Question. Sheikh Nuruddin al-Hindi asked our belief concerning Noah's age. Did he live 950 years as revealed in the Holy Quran, or does this have another meaning? Answer. Those who are knowledgeable concerning such matters are divided between two views, one religious and the other scientific. The religious view is as follows. It is well known that whoever believes in the truth of the mission of the Prophet Muhammad and believes that the Holy Quran is the book of God revealed from heaven necessarily accepts the validity of everything contained in that noble book. He acknowledges the truth of whatever was revealed therein, whether or not it accords with the understanding of the people, as long as clear reason does not judge it impossible and no decisive proof against it can be shown to exist. Anyone who has the least familiarity with rational proofs and logical analogies accepts as self-evident that the only objection to the extreme longevity the ancients are said to have enjoyed is that such a thing is simply unlikely. However, in reality it is not rationally untenable. For not the least convincing proof exists that it is impossible for people to enjoy a greater longevity than is normal in our own times. This is especially so for human beings who lived in ancient times and past ages, because there is no way to investigate their circumstances or the length of their lives, owing to the inaccessibility of their history and the disappearance of all traces of their civilization. A prudent mind will refrain from deciding against that which was revealed in the Holy Quran merely because it is unlikely. Quote, "It is verily a decisive word, nor is it in jest." Unquote. As for the scientific view, it is this. It is obvious that no scholarly investigator will accept the authority of any statement unless he can determine their original sources and the degree to which these are reliable and trustworthy. It is, moreover, well known that there are only 4 historical traditions containing information on how the creation began, which are held in high esteem by great nations, and whose sources they find dependable. These are Buddhist history, that of the Chinese, Hindu history, that of the original inhabitants of India, Zoroastrian history, that of the first peoples of Persia and their great rulers, and Hebrew history, that of the Jews and others who accept the mission of Moses. These historical traditions differ irreconcilably in their concepts, contain the diverse beliefs of their peoples, exhibit a huge variance in chronology, and clearly differ as to the names and events they mention. In spite of all this, the observer will note with amazement that these historical traditions accord with one another in 2 ways. One is their common assertion that the ancients lived extremely long lives compared to what became normal in later times, and the other is their intermixture with stories greatly resembling myths, in the eyes of scholarly investigators, or riddles, enigmas, and symbols, in the eyes of the moderates. As for the Buddhist, Hindu, and Zoroastrian histories, they contain no mention of Adam and Eve, or of Seth, Noah, or the others. Neither do they mention their stories or the events associated with their lives. Not even similar names occur in them. Only the Hebrew history mentions these names. and from there they were transmitted to the Christians and Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad said, "We, the concourse of prophets, were sent to address people according to the capacity of their minds, and likewise speak to the people of that with which they are familiar. Do you wish God and his messenger to be called liars?" Thus was it related by the learned judge Averroes in Spain in his book Exposition on Methods of Evidence Concerning the Doctrines of the Muslim Community, citing al-Bukhari. Therefore, given this situation, it is permissible for the scholarly investigator to depend on the verses of the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet in historical questions. It is clear that the prophets and manifestations of the cause of God were sent to guide the nations, to improve their characters, and to bring the people nearer to their source and ultimate goal. They were not sent as historians, astronomers, philosophers, or natural scientists. Their position in the world of creation is like that of the heart in the body. It has a universal position with a general effect. The position of the learned in the world of earthly dominion is like that of a specific organ. That is, they have a particular position and a special effect. Therefore, the prophets have indulged the people in regard to their historical notions, folk stories, and scientific principles, and have spoken to them according to these. They conversed as was appropriate to their audience, and hid certain realities behind the curtain of illusion. They secluded the holy maidens of meaning in the palaces of sacred verses, veiling them in eloquent metaphors. A rational human being will therefore have no doubt that those things mentioned in the Holy Quran, such as how the creation commenced, the debate of the angels, the stories of Adam, of Satan, and of Noah and the flood, are all realities. These speak of repeated promises to renew the world, and refer to the appointed times for the expiration, through the advent of the primal holy reality and the renewal of the divine laws, of the terms allotted to the nations. But, from the point of view of science, it is impermissible for the historian to depend on the literal meaning of these verses. This is because he cannot discount the very real possibility that they possess a higher significance and are subject to sublime, figurative interpretations, which differ from the understanding that might be gained from their external sense. The possibility that these verses should be interpreted figuratively is hardly a remote one, nor is it an unlikely concept which can be disregarded by the eminent and learned as insignificant. For it has been revealed in the Holy Quran, quote, "Nay, they deny that which their knowledge does not encompass, though its interpretation has not yet come to them." Unquote. Another verse says, "Do they look for aught else but its interpretation? The day its interpretation comes, those who forgot it before shall say, 'Indeed, our Lord's messengers come with the truth.'" Moreover, the traditions and practice of the prophet have genuinely established and made it abundantly clear that the verses of the Quran have mysterious and profound esoteric meanings and exalted, subtle, figurative interpretations. These are known by those who have dedicated themselves to the Holy Book and are ultimately familiar with it, for God has granted to his steadfast, sincere servants the ability to discover them. By figurative interpretation is meant only the original meanings intended, which God veiled in the inner depths of the verses and hid behind a curtain of metaphors. Such interpretation is not something for mere mortals, nor should every ignorant one plunge haphazardly into it. Nor every obscure scholar interpret the verses according to his opinion. Some of the ignorant have done this in their pride, and have gone astray and led many others astray with their interpretations. They have thus kept people from the wellspring of life, the path of salvation. Rather, this is a matter for the manifestations of the cause of God, the vindicators of his promise. This has been said clearly in the Quran, quote, So when we recite it, follow thou its recitation, then ours it is to explain it. Unquote. It has, therefore, been established that the historian cannot depend on the outward meaning of the verses of the Quran for historical knowledge, and that Noah and his like are not mentioned in the rest of the ancient histories. And so, the historian is left with only the Pentateuch and the other books of the Old Testament. If he avoids sectarian prejudices, blind traditionalism, and popular fabrications, an insightful critic will perceive that these holy books have two distinct sorts of teachings, which deserve further attention. The first sort is the teachings attributed to God, which are spoken by God, or which consist of revelation from God. These contain ordinances, commandments, laws, and directions. They also contain warnings and glad tidings, the most important of which are predictions concerning the signs, portents, and circumstances, signaling the advent of the day of God. Such are the 10 Commandments of Moses, and his hymn of blessing at the end of Deuteronomy, the Psalms of David, the book of Isaiah the prophet, and the books of Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and other prophets of Israel. Anyone upon whom God has bestowed insight and the gift of knowledge can distinguish between human words and the verses of God, and will confess that all these books are made up of divine verses and heavenly prophecies and warnings. These shine forth from the blessed bush of Moses, like a lighted lamp in the depths of night, or a star rising in the farthest heaven. The second sort of teachings is those that contain information concerning such historical matters as how the creation began, the development of various tribes, the dispersal of mankind over the earth, the history of the lives and times of the prophets, and the enumeration of kings, and the events occurring during their reigns. Of this sort are the histories contained in the Pentateuch, from the beginning of Adam's creation until the death of Moses. Likewise, included are the historical books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel 1 and 2, Kings 1 and 2, Chronicles 1 and 2, Ezra, Nehemiah, and so on. In these works there is no open statement, or any sign, or indeed the faintest hint that they are celestial revelation, or divine inspiration or speech. Therefore, it is impermissible for the historian to depend on them, or to assert that their contents contain no error, or to consider them revelation. This could be done only if one were sure of the identity of the authors of these books. Anyone who is aware of the degree to which scholars differ over the identities of the writers of these histories, and the evidence on which each faction depends in establishing its view or belief, knows that to rely on the correctness of the contents of these books is not permissible. It would be utterly foolish for a person of critical reason to depend on a book whose author cannot be established by research, or to consider it divine revelation when, in spite of extensive examination and detailed investigation, its author and source remain unknown. For example, when one pages through the works of the most eminent scholars on the identity of the author of the Pentateuch, which is the foundation of the Old Testament and the basis of Hebrew history, one sees that there are great differences which no one could hope to resolve through inquiry and investigation. Nor could one expect to arrive at a foundation that is, in the final analysis, at all sound. Many scholars used to think that Moses was the author of these books. However, the final passages of this book refute those scholars and render their views worthless, as they mention the death of Moses, and how the Israelites held a wake for him. Other pieces of evidence clearly indicate the books were composed long after Moses' passing. Some scholars have, without any evidence, asserted that everything but the last 2 chapters of Deuteronomy was written by Moses, and that these latter are the work of Joshua, the son of Nun. He is said to have written them and added them to the 5 books of Moses, to complete it by finishing Moses' biography and clarifying the circumstances of the people after his death. Others say that these books were composed by Jeremiah or another of the prophets of Israel. This assertion, like the preceding ones, suffers from weak justification and lack of evidence. One group of scholars has said, and perhaps correctly so, since the argument has some force, that they are compositions of Ezra the soothsayer, referred to in the Quran as Uzair. After the people returned from the Babylonian exile at the order of Ardashir the Great, Jerusalem was rebuilt, the Jews were gathered together, and the house of David was revived. At that time, the people asked Ezra for a copy of the Hebrew Bible. He was a learned man, a skillful writer, and a pious soothsayer. He had studied in the great schools of the city of Babylon, acquiring wide knowledge and useful arts unrivaled for his time. Babylon was then the refuge of civilization and the dawning place of the light of science and philosophy. Ezra then wrote, in answer to the people's request, 5 books on how the creation began, how the people split up, how the tribes branched off, and how mankind developed until the death of Moses. He included therein the story of how Moses, or Joshua, according to some of the Bible's verses, see Joshua 24, legislated for the organization of his people's affairs. To sum up, first, it is apparent that the stories of Noah and the others are not mentioned in the histories of the great peoples of antiquity, such as the Chinese, the Persians, and the Indians. At the same time, no one can belittle the breadth of their knowledge, the antiquity of their civilizations, the remoteness of their eras, the vastness of their kingdoms, or the wide fame of their attainments. Second, research is unable to establish the identity of the author of the Hebrew Pentateuch. Finally, it is well known that neither the Prophet Muhammad nor the rest of the prophets ever engaged in disputes with the people about their historical beliefs, but addressed them according to their local traditions. It is therefore necessary to conclude that interpreters and investigators may not come to a final opinion on these matters on the basis of sure knowledge. If the way should be barred to individual judgment, then only the religious point of view would remain, and this would consist of worshipful submission to the literal meanings of whatever has issued from the prophets and messengers. One of the most astounding things is that, so far, researchers have failed to find in the ancient Egyptian ruins even the slightest evidence that the Israelites were ever in Egypt. This has confused the scholars, attracted the attention of the wise and intelligent, thrown suspicion on what used to be considered universally accepted, and forced historians to re-examine and carefully investigate even those things they had considered self-evident. No trace has been found of Moses' mission to the Israelites, their plea for salvation from Pharaoh's tyranny over Moses' leadership, or their immigration to the plains of Syria under his standard. Yet the Israelites were a warlike people, numbering the warriors among them at 800,000 or more. Pharaoh pursued them with his troops, who all drowned in the sea of their infidelity and atheism. In the ancient Egyptian ruins, as scholars are aware, accurate histories have been discovered which time had obscured and buried, so that their mention had been obliterated from the history books. Centuries and cycles passed until God revived them in this glorious age. This is the age wherein mysteries have been unraveled, the light of lights has dawned, and the accumulated darkness of confusion has been unexpectedly dispelled. A number of Western scholars have arisen and have discovered the truth of Egyptian history from ancient ruins. From these have appeared the names of the kings and pharaohs, their deeds and circumstances, the number of their houses and families, their religion and customs, and their gods and rites. These ruins have allowed scholars to recover clear references to the pharaohs, to order the sequence of their reigns correctly, to enrich history with a new epoch, and to give the science of archaeology a firm foundation. All these ancient artifacts, including the mummified corpses of pharaohs, are preserved in the Egyptian Museum. Travelers and learned men set out for their great temples, coming from Europe and America, to uncover historical information and to visit the Egyptian monuments. They have not yet found any corroboration for the Old Testament stories about Moses, Aaron, and Joshua, or their circumstances. Neither have they found anything concerning their forebears, such as Adam, Seth, and Noah. Those who believe in the Old Testament histories are bewildered as to how to fill in this huge gap. They have been profoundly alarmed by the crumbling of the foundations of this great historical tradition. For it is unimaginable that the Egyptians, who depicted on walls every event, great or small, and inscribed in stone everything that happened in Egypt, whether temporal or religious in nature, should have neglected to mention such extraordinary and stupendous occurrences as Moses' demonstration of amazing signs and the drowning of Pharaoh and his huge army. Some have propped their chins in the palms of their hands in astonishment, still hoping for some way to adjust things or patch them up. Others are waiting for more investigation and research, so that they may find a path to corroboration and agreement. God knows best how this affair of the archaeologists and those who are waiting expectantly will end up. In any case, this should suffice those with insight.